Hello, everyone. Matthew Joseph here from Massachusetts, and today I'm reading one of my favorite stories, the Curious George series. And today's book is Curious George Rides a Bike, and it's by H.A. Rey. At breakfast, George's friend said, "Today we're going to celebrate because just 3 years ago, this day, I brought you home with me for the jungle. So tonight, I'm going to take you to the animal show. But first, I have a surprise for you." He took George out to the yard where a big box was standing. George, of course, was very curious. Out of the box came a bicycle. George was delighted. That's what he had always wanted, a bicycle, and now he knows how to ride a bicycle. But he's never had one all his own. "I must go now," his man in the yellow hat said, "but I'll be back in time for the show. Be careful with your new bike and keep close to the house while I am gone." We know George might not do that. George could ride very well. He could even do all sorts of tricks. Monkeys are good at that. For instance, he could ride this way with both hands off the handlebar. He could ride this way like a cowboy in a wild bronco, and he could ride backwards. Wow. George should have a helmet on. He does lots of tricks. Then George went out onto the street. A newsboy was just passing by with his bag full of newspapers. "That's a fine bike you got there," said George. "How would you like to help me deliver papers?" said the paper boy. He handed George the bag and told him to do one of the streets first and then turn around and do the other side. George was proud and he rode off with his bag of newspapers. He started to deliver the papers on one side of the street as he was told. Then he came to the last house. He saw a little river, and George was curious. He wanted to know what the river was like, so instead of turning back and delivering the rest of the papers, George went down to the river. There was a lot to see at the river. A man was fishing from the bridge, a duck family was paddling downstream, and the two boys were playing with their boats. George would have liked to stop and look at the boats, but he was afraid the boy might find out that he had not delivered all of his papers. So he kept riding. While riding along, George kept thinking about boats. It was so much fun to have a boat. But how would he get one? He was just a monkey. But then he had an idea. He got off the bicycle, took the newspaper out of the bag, and began to fold it. First, he folded one corner. Then he folded the next corner. Then he folded both edges up, flattened it, and he did all that work, and he had a boat. Now, the moment had come to launch his boat. Would it float? Guess what? It did. So George decided to make some more boats. Finally, he had used up all the papers that he had made, and he made so many boats, it was like a fleet of boats. Watching his fleet sail down the river, George felt like an admiral. But watching his fleet, he forgot to watch out where he was going. Suddenly, there was a terrible jolt, and the bike hit a rock, and George flew off his seat head first. Luckily, he was not hurt. Remember, I said he should have wore a helmet. But the front of the bicycle wheel was out of shape, and the tire was blown. Oh boy, now what? George tried to ride a bicycle, but of course it wouldn't go on a flat tire. So he started carrying it, but the bike was too heavy. His new bike was broken, the newspapers were gone. He wished he had listened to his friend and kept close to the house. Now he just stood there and cried. But suddenly, his face brightened. Why, he had forgotten that he could ride on one wheel. He tried and it worked. something he had never seen before, then rolled in. And it came towards him on a large tractor. Looking out of the trailer were all sorts of animals. George looked at it, and it looked like a zoo on wheels. The tractor stopped, and two men jumped out. "Well, well, well," said one of the men, "a little monkey who can ride a bike like a bronco fashion. We can use you in our animal show tonight. I'm the director of the show, and this is Bob. He can straighten your wheel and fix that flat tire in no time, and then we'll take you along to the place where the show is going to be." So the three of them got into the cab and drove off. "Maybe you can play a fanfare when you ride your bike to the show," the director said, "and I have a bugle for you." Should be interesting. On the show grounds, everyone was busy getting things ready for the show. "I must do some work now," said the director. "Meanwhile, you may have to look around and get acquainted with all the animals. But you must not feed them, especially the ostrich, because he will eat anything and he might get really, really sick. I don't want that." George was curious. Would the ostrich really eat anything? Would he eat a bugle? George went a little closer to the cage, and before he knew it, the ostrich had snatched the bugle and tried to swallow it. But the bugle is hard to swallow, even for an ostrich. It got stuck in his throat. Funny sounds came out of the bugle as the ostrich was struggling with it, and he got all blue in the face, and George actually got really frightened. Fortunately, the men had heard the noise. They came running in, and they got the bugle out of the ostrich's throat just in time. The director was very angry with George. "We cannot use a little monkey who doesn't do as they are told," he said. "Of course, you cannot take part in the show now. We'll have to send you home." George had to sit on a bench by himself, and nobody even looked at him. He was terribly sorry for what he had done, but it was too late. He had spoiled everything. Meanwhile, the ostrich was always hungry. He had gotten hold of the string that was dangling near the cage. This happened to be the string which held the door to the baby bear. As the ostrich nibbled at it, the door opened and the baby bear got out. He ran away as fast as he could and made it straight for the high tree near a camp. Nobody saw it but George. George was not supposed to leave his bench, but this was an emergency. So he jumped up, grabbed the bugle, blew it as loud as he could, then he rushed to his bicycle. The men had heard the alarm and thought at first that George had been naughty again. But when he saw the empty cage and the ostrich nibbling on the string, they knew what had happened. The bear had run away. George raced towards the tree, far ahead of the men. By now, the bear was climbing the tree quite high, and it was really dangerous because bears can climb trees easily, but it's hard for them to come down. They may fall and get hurt. The men worried. They did not know how to get him down safely, but George had a plan. With the bag over his shoulder, he went up a tree as fast as only a monkey can, and when he reached the baby bear, he put him in a bag and carefully let him down, so the men carefully would save him. It's exciting. Everyone cheered, and George came down from the tree. "You're a brave little monkey," said the director. "You saved the baby bear. Now you can have a coat, and of course you can ride your bike and play the bugle in the show." Finally, the show was on. And to everyone's surprise, in the middle of it, they saw the man and they saw George. The newsboy was even there too. And of course, George's friend, the man in the yellow hat. The whole town was there. The man in the yellow hat had been looking for George everywhere and was happy to finally find him. The newsboy was glad to have his bag back, and the people from the other side of the street, whose papers they never got, George made them into boats, but they weren't mad anymore. When it was time to say goodbye, the director let him keep the coat and his hat in the Bugle, and George and his friend got into the car and they went home. So Curious George Rides a Bike, one of my favorites. I do like Curious George. Maybe I'll read a few more of the Curious George series during this time.